What's the most surprising backstory of a person you thought you knew well? My best friend's dad was an inspector for the police department. Basically, he'd be leading all the drug busts and whatnot. We're not talking about small-time busts, we're talking big busts the DEA would be in on. I always thought they had a very upper-middle-class way of living off a one household salary. His mom didn't work. Turns out, his dad and his partner would go to a drug bust as normal. But if there was, say, $250,000 worth of cash in the house, they'd only report $125,000 worth, and the rest would go into their pockets. And of course, he knew how to make the money clean and end up in the bank without suspicion. I guess it was about a decade before the department was curious, and they set up a stain where they had $200,000 in a closet, bugged the room, and saw how much they took and reported was in there. They reported they found 90% of the planted. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but got out after 1.5. One of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet, so it was shocking he was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. A friend told me his family is kind of famous in this area, because his grandma was the best yodeler around here. Discovering that a friend who always seemed carefree and happy had battled severe depression for years before finding stability. Worked with a guy who I considered a friend. I worked on the East Coast and he in the West, but we often had joint projects. We would travel to client meetings together and grab beers, go to games, etc. Even went to his wedding. One day the FBI shows up at my door asking about him. Without going into too many details, before I knew him he was running an extortion racket with his then GF. They would target wealthy guys, GF would seduce them, they would record it, and extort the victim. He's currently in federal prison. My girlfriend in college, while she was in college, I was working in the dining hall on campus. Well, she told me on our third or fourth date that she grew up in a nudist family. Her parents were hippies, they went to Woodstock. Yes, I'm old. It took me off guard since I never met a nudist, but didn't scare me off since we've been together 30 years. My best friend's mom was a Guinness Book of World Records holder for longest hula hooping session back in the 1970s. I'm not sure how long she held the record, but my mind was blown upon learning this. It was such a random tidbit of info. Worked with a guy in the 2000s, just a really tall, quiet, nice fella, and we'd shoot the breeze sometimes about the local teams and all. He came in one day with a big shiner and he said it happened at his other job. I didn't ask. I later found out he was a part-time pro wrestler, and it was due to a hit landing the wrong way. He played an old-school heel, and his ring persona was so far removed from him that you had to laugh. My son and I would go to the shows and have a blast. My first job I worked with an older Mexican dude, super chill guy, and he took me under his wing because I reminded him of one of his kids. One of the nicest guys I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Turns out, dude ran with the Chicano gang back when he was younger, and told me a few times that he killed people and spent quite a lot of time in prison. Lost contact with him when I moved to a different city, but I ran into him a few years later and he became something of a local real estate mogul, owning a lot of bars and clubs in my hometown. Never asked him how that happened, because honestly, I was too afraid to ask. This one dude, until one day he decided to neck himself. And this other dude that was shot in the chest by the police because their parent called on them and over-exaggerated their child's condition. Not really surprising because I had known about it, but kind of a surreal experience to actually see it for the first time. My dad and uncle made a public access TV series back in the 80s. It was a show of unrelated vignette short stories, but I was never able to watch them until recently when my uncle digitized the Betamax tapes. It's a very unusual thing for someone my age to be able to see an extended amount of video footage of my parents and their friends as young adults. They are mostly retired now. These are the same people I've known throughout my entire life, but back in a different era of their lives that I really only knew about before from them telling me stories. I was surprised realizing how much Dad at my current age reminded me of myself. Same mannerisms, personality, sense of humor, receding hairline, etc. The storylines were very similar to how I would have written them. At my college there is this girl who wrote a bunch of papers on suicidology and suicide prevention, even presenting at a conference. Then she took a year off for medical issues and we found out it was a failed suicide attempt. She's back now. Now that's just sad and extremely ironic. My best friend, basically we were just talking online one night and he mentions, oh, my dad has 50 children. Then I was like, what the heck, continue. Basically his father had multiple different affairs with multiple different women. I think he is still on the run, so he has 50 brothers and sisters, like half brothers and sisters scatter all over the United States. I think one of them tried to contact them on Facebook, but I don't know, I didn't want to continue asking more questions. A guy who I'm close with was a heavy drug user in his youth. I'm assuming meth, but I didn't ask for specifics. I don't know the entirety of the story, but it was shocking when I found out. He's a pretty stereotypical suburban dad now. Another guy I know constantly told obviously exaggerated stories about his life, from participating in a violent overthrow of his country's governmental, to faking his own death to escape mobsters, to being an underground bare-knuckle fighter, to being embedded with the US Navy SEALs. The surprising thing was going to his house and seeing pictures, news clippings, and other memorabilia basically confirming everything he told me. Work with an older guy, very eccentric, very warm, and a really hard worker. He was a big hippie in the past and was arrested protesting at Stonehenge. Turns out he was arrested for armed robbery too. He told us his mates robbed a post office in Cornwall, but the getaway driver crashed and they got caught. Said he made mates with a guy in prison called Biscuit Tin, asked him why he was called that, and he says one day he got sick of his wife, cut off her head, and put it in a biscuit tin. I have no idea if it's a tall tale, but it entertains me every time someone asks him about his time in prison. My best friends, two of them, F and they are both M. They didn't like each other and they weren't friends, but they were my BFFs. I lost my mom to cancer and grandmother. Then I was diagnosed with cancer and both of them said awful things. One said I hope you die and the other said all you do is talk about cancer, 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 and hung up on me. I did not talk about cancer, BC. I knew he didn't like talking about emotional or empathetic stuff, so I did not talk to him about my health problems to him. They were my BFFs of over 30 years, but turns out I never really knew them underneath at all. Time tells, like my grandmother would say, and it sure does. We'll never speak to those guys again, as they are miserable and heartless to say that to anyone, let alone your BFF. I don't trust many people after that. Also, uncle died and went back to my hometown to take care of stuff and get my brother into mental hospital. Every friend I had come to my house to visit with stole everything. I mean everything, even my plunger. These were lifelong acquaintances. So basically everyone I know has surprised me. And when you are really down and need a friend, that's when you really get surprised. No longer a people person, BC of people, I could go on and on, but these are just a few. Years ago I met this woman who appeared to be a total trophy wife. Husband was a doctor, in his 60s, she was in her 40s, banging body, amazing fake boobs. I started hitting it on the side. Turns out she had been in the army, and was one of the first female paratroopers who had graduated jump school.